Advocates is made possible by grants from the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation and Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith, Incorporated.
For the first time, there's an elected black government in Rhodesia, and the United States should move to acknowledge and support it.
There has been no meaningful transfer of power in Rhodesia from the white minority to the black majority, and as a consequence, the United States should oppose that regime.
Good evening and welcome to The Advocates. I'm Marilyn Berger. Tonight we're going to examine our policy towards the newly elected government of Zimbabwe, Rhodesia. In 1965, the white government in Rhodesia unilaterally declared its independence from Britain. That declaration sparked a guerrilla movement, which grew into open warfare about 6 years ago. The guerrilla forces are joined under the Patriotic Front, led by Joshua Nkomo and Robert Mugabe. The United States never recognized the government, and since 1968 has participated in United Nations sanctions against Rhodesia. There are about 230,000 whites and 6.8 million blacks now living in Rhodesia. Last year, partly from the pressure of the continuing war, the white government agreed to an internal settlement with several moderate black leaders. An election was held last April 25th. And Bishop Abel Muzawaira's party emerged with a majority of parliamentary seats. In early June, he'll become the first black prime minister of a renamed Zimbabwe Rhodesia. But the Patriotic Front continues its fight, maintaining that the Constitution is illegitimate and that the elections are a sham. Should we give our support to the new government of Zimbabwe Rhodesia? Advocate Avi Nelson says yes.
There have been elections in Rhodesia, and a new government, a black government, has been duly elected. The United States should recognize that government and remove economic sanctions. To help me make that case tonight, I have three distinguished witnesses. Mr. Leonard Sussman, who is the Executive Director of Freedom House, Professor Matthew Wakatama, member of the newly elected Majority Party in Rhodesia, and a professor at City University in New York, and Professor Chester Crocker, the Director of African Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies at Georgetown University. There has been a significant departure from the Ian Smith regime. There is a black prime minister of Rhodesia. 72 seats of a parliament of 100 are now held by duly elected black representatives. There is a document, a transition document, to move from the colonial regimen to the new majority rule, one man, one vote. All of these things represent departures from the past, and they should be acknowledged by our government. Unfortunately, there are other leaders, also black, who are contesting that. So there is guerrilla warfare, there is terrorism, and unfortunately, a state of war in Rhodesia. If we continue with these economic sanctions, we will hurt the existing fledgling government in Rhodesia, and we will, in effect, assist the guerrillas and terrorism. The U.S. Senate has moved to recognize the new government. We would like to see the Congress in full and the present administration do likewise.
Thank you. Advocate Randall Robinson says no.
The recent elections in Rhodesia do not alter the fundamental reality that there has been and can be, under this Constitution, no significant transfer of power from blacks, from whites, who comprise less than 3% of the population, to the overwhelming majority of blacks. And American support for that regime would signal to Africa and to the rest of the world that this country embraces racism and white minority rule. Helping me to make this case that there should be no American support for this regime are Senator Paul Tsongas, Sister Janet McLaughlin, a nun who has lived and worked in Rhodesia, and in Callistus Ndlovu, representative to the United Nations from the Patriotic Front. What does democracy mean, Rhodesia style? It means, under this Constitution, for which whites only have voted and blacks have not been allowed to vote, that whites will maintain full control over the vast administrative machinery of government. The police, the army, the civil service, half the land and virtually all of the wealth will remain in white hands. Lastly, an alignment with Rhodesia on this issue squarely aligns the United States with South Africa against the rest of Africa and virtually the entire family of nations.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll get to the cases in a moment. The United States Senate has passed a resolution, that's a sense of the Senate resolution, urging that President Carter lift the economic sanctions against Rhodesia, something this administration is very reluctant to do. By supporting the new government, we mean acknowledge its existence, engage in trade, encourage its activities, but support does not necessarily mean formal diplomatic recognition. And now to the cases. Mr. Nelson, would you call your first witness?
I call Mr. Leonard Sussman.
Mr. Sussman, welcome to the Advocates.
Mr. Sussman is the executive director of Freedom House, and perhaps we should begin, Mr. Sussman, what exactly is Freedom House?
Freedom House for 38 years has tried to do things and say things that we hope will help strengthen free societies around the world.
Now, you sponsored an observation team to watch the elections in Rhodesia. Exactly what was it you were doing?
This was a 9-man team, the purpose of which was to attempt to discover whether these elections were valid, whether in fact they would represent an expression of the majority will of the people of Rhodesia.
And what did you find?
We found, after traversing a good part of the country, taking a team of specialists, 5 of whom are political and social scientists, examining hundreds and hundreds of voters at the polls, examining officials, we found essentially, and this is the consensus of the specialists' view, that it was the freest election that had ever been held in Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, freer than all but one of the surrounding countries, freer indeed than most developing countries in all the world.
What were the results of that election?
Well, the results placed into power the black majority rule of Bishop Meserewa. The results, in our view, clearly indicated that the people of Rhodesia were making a statement. They were trying to say as clearly as possible to us, it seemed, and they said this to us individually as we met them. They want to stop the war. They want to use the mechanism they found clearest at hand to say this, and the election was that. It was an effort to say as clearly and as dramatically as possible that they want something to happen. They chose various parties as an expression of how they would have this done, but clearly the election was an expression of the majority will, and between 53 to 64% of the eligible voters came out to vote.
Mr. Sussman, what about the process itself, the electoral process?
The process, in our view, was technically about as good as one could expect under a security situation. The details of the election, we found the fact that individuals had to put their hands in chemicals in order to be sure they hadn't voted earlier, a necessity produced simply by the fact that there were efforts to prevent people from voting, threats to kill people at polls. So obviously security was essential. And in some of the pictures that you may be seeing of the security force man standing beside the poll, quite obviously there had to be this in order to ensure the fact that there could be an election under threats of interference with the election.
Of course, we have police at polling places in the United States
Yes,
when we
do.
vote, too.
Yes, we do.
Mr. Sussman, what about, we've heard a lot of talk about the threats of coercion, that there was martial law, that the white government, in effect, forced blacks to vote. Was this true?
We didn't find this. We found there were pressures, of course. There were pressures against voting. There were also pressures to vote. Parties pressured people to vote. The government encouraged people to vote. Employers encourage people to vote, as they may in this country and other countries. But the various pressures, in our view, tended to balance one another out in the total result.
One last question. What do you think the United States policy should be toward the new government as a result of these elections?
In our view, this was a validating exercise. The people were saying something. A majority of the people were trying to express themselves through the vote. It seems to me, and to Freedom House, that the United States can do only one thing, and that is to put itself affirmatively on the side of the election and its result. In terms of sanctions, it seems to me, this does not necessarily mean the immediate removal of sanctions, but it certainly indicates, it seems to me, the United States should be saying, we recognize this was a validating process, We will work with you to improve the democratization of the country in a variety of ways.
All right, thank you. We'll get back to you in a minute. Mr. Nelson, Mr. Robinson, would you like to cross-examine?
Mr. Sussman, are you aware that in all of the independence constitutions written for African decolonization, this is the first constitution that has ever been drafted that sets aside solely on the basis of race, special privilege and power for whites?
Not quite true.
It is quite true.
It's quite, let me finish.
Please.
It's not quite true in this sense. There were constitutions in other countries, in Tanzania and others, in Zambia, prior to independence, which produced a step-by-step movement toward the total...
Precisely, Mr. Sussman.
Precisely. And this is an interim situation. This is an interim situation.
The independence constitution in all of these countries had no racial features. This is not an interim situation. This is a negotiation for independence. They had phases in those constitutions. The longest phase was 2 years. This is a closed-in 10-year period, if not indefinite, in which there can be no negotiation of disproportionate white power. Do you understand, Mr. Sussman, that this Constitution takes outside of the power of the whole Parliament and puts under white-only commissions the vast and virtually only power to run this country for the next 10 years, if not indefinitely? There is no other Constitution in the history of decolonization like that. How do you justify that?
Justify it on two bases. The first is that from a political standpoint, it can very well be an interim constitution. There's nothing that says the Constitution...
How can they? They made an agreement last March 3rd to sign this Constitution.
They can make another agreement next March 3rd.
Are you suggesting that they ought to throw over this Constitution that they solemnly entered into, that you are supporting?
I'm suggesting that the black majority government will have the right to make political changes. And the United States, it seems to me, should be on the side of assisting the black majority
government
ask you another question. To make political changes. There's one other point. And
let me ask you another question.
No, let me answer
I don't want you to eat up my time. There's another question you must respond.
I haven't answered the first one. The process is the important thing. If we felt that this was the end result, we might not think it's as good a result
the
as it is.
Constitution suggests that it's the end result, and we have a racial feature here that preserves for the next 10 years, if not indefinitely, special privilege and power for whites.
But then you must ask the blacks why.
Let me ask another question. You understand that the British set aside 6 principles that have to be satisfied as a basis on which independence would be granted to any of the countries that independence has been given to. One of the principles, the 5th principle, says that the Constitution has to be acceptable to all of the people of the country. In this case, whites were given an opportunity to vote on the Constitution. Blacks were denied that right. The only blacks who had any chance to review this Constitution were the 16 members of Parliament in January, who all voted against it.
Well, for one very good reason. The whites voted because they were the ones yielding power.
They denied the blacks the chance to do this because in '72, when the Pierce Commission took a survey of this, they determined that the blacks were unhappy with what was the formula then and would be unhappy with what would be the formula now.
We'll need a quick answer if you have one.
The quick answer is the Anglo-American plan, which Ambassador Young and the Americans have agreed to, would have affected precisely the same
Do you believe that?
Sorry, we're going to have to go on to our next witness. Thank you, Mr. Sussman, for joining us on The Advocates. Mr. Nelson, would you call your next witness?
I call Professor Matthew Wakatama, please.
Dr. Wakatama, thank you for joining us on The Advocates.
Professor Wakatama is a member of the newly elected majority party, the Bishop Mezarewa party in Rhodesia, and is a professor of education at Medgar Evers College at the City University in New York. Professor, why did you agree to this internal settlement? You and your party agreed to it.
Well, we agreed to this internal settlement because all these years we've been fighting for majority rule, one man, one vote. And since Smith conceded to this, we agreed that we should go in and negotiate.
But you heard the criticism a moment ago that this Constitution, this document, this setup, gives too much power to the whites. So why would you accept it?
It doesn't really give too much power to the whites. You'll find that when you say it gives too much power to the whites, the Constitution itself has a mechanism in which it can be changed by the blacks winning 6 seats on the white side, so that 78 can really change the constitution before 10 years period.
How does it compare to other constitutions during transition periods for other emerging African nations?
Well, other African countries like Tanzania, Zambia, to just name two, you'll find that they didn't get all the sectors of government at one go. They had, in fact, you find that in our constitution, it means that the vote is given to people who are 18 years old, whereas in these others, it was 21 years as well as educational and income qualifications.
Let's try to turn around the other way. Is there any advantage to having the whites in government?
Oh, sure. You see, in Zimbabwe, we are not fighting against whites as whites. We are fighting against the system. And since the system can therefore be changed, we need the whites to work and develop our country. After all, some of the whites have been in that country for 4 to 5 generations.
We talked about majority rule is on the way. There is a new government elected. Why is there still a war going on in Rhodesia?
Well, the war is going on because in Rhodesia, the elections wouldn't stop the war. In fact, even if Zabuzanu won, the next day they would be fighting each other. Question being asked is who is in the driver's seat?
Why did you say Zabuzanu? That, of course, is part of the Patriotic Front, the people who are fighting. Why didn't they participate in the electoral process?
Well, they excluded themselves. They didn't want to participate. And this originated, in fact, even from the Geneva Conference.
Was it because they were afraid they wouldn't have majority support?
Sure.
In terms of the United States, what will happen if the United States does not support the new government?
Well, if the United States does not support the new government, it will mean that it will undermine the progress of the new government. And also, it will mean that there's going to be really chaos because black against black is going to fight, and this is what we want to stop. We don't want to be led into a one-party state or even taking the colonial yoke for African dictatorship.
What
Thank
will
you,
happen
Mr. Robinson. Would you like to cross-examine the witness?
Thank you. Doesn't it disturb you, Professor? As a black, it would disturb me that your vote in any election will have tremendously less weight than any white vote. I think the white vote weighs 11 times as much as yours in value. You've got 3% of the population electing 28% of the House, 33% of the Senate. Isn't that extraordinary to you, controlling the bureaucracy and the machinery of the administration of government?
Do you know what
Don't you support, would you not support one person, one vote, equality, irrespective of race?
But do you know what percentage in Tanzania represented the whites?
I mean, Professor, that's not so.
1% of the population represented by 30%.
In the independence constitution of Tanzania, there's no reference to race at all. In Kenya, in Zambia, at the time of independence, no reference to race.
Sure.
Sure.
You see, what you've got to understand.
I'm sure.
Yes.
I want you to be sure.
Sure. What you've got to understand. What you've got to understand is that the situation in Zimbabwe is not the same as in other countries. Let me tell you. Let me answer your question. In all these other African countries, white people went there as civil servants, traders, missionaries. But in Zimbabwe, the white people went there as settlers, and that complicated the situation.
Does that mean you contest it less vigorously? I mean, how do you feel in a group of 97% without the power for at least 10 years to amend your own constitution?
No, to me, I see that there is no impediment.
That doesn't bother you?
There is no impediment because, as I have said before, there is a mechanism in which the constitution can be changed before the 10-year period.
Did you vote in the recent elections?
Well, I was here.
You were here?
I was here.
Don't you recognize that whites who were abroad voted by virtue of postal ballot, that it was available to whites and not to you because you're black?
No. The question is that I wasn't prepared for it. I mean, I wasn't prepared for the postal vote.
No, you weren't prepared for it because it was
for
proscribed by law. You weren't prepared for it because you're black and you're not white.
No. I don't accept that.
No, that is the law.
That's what you said.
I'm wondering about how you feel about racism being enshrined into the very constitution of your country. You say it can change. You made an interesting comment on direct examination. You said that you needed 78 votes in the parliament to amend the Constitution. Only 72 of which will be blacks, so you need 6 white votes. The same whites have pledged to vote as a bloc. But you said that your party could win 6 of those votes. Are blacks going to become whites?
No.
How?
They're not going to become whites, but you see,
28 of the seats are set aside for whites.
This means that the black people who are going to go to parliament should be able to persuade at least 6 votes to be on their side, so that the whites, seeing that changes are necessary for their own interests,
you realize
they will
that
change.
the Rhodesian Front members of parliament have taken a blood oath with each other that should they vote against any party position, that that person will resign? Because the Constitution is solely designed to protect the interest and privilege and power of whites indefinitely.
This is going to change as soon as there's a black prime minister.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wakatama. Thank you very much for joining us on The Advocate. Mr. Robinson, would you call your first witness, please?
I call Dr. Callistus Ndlovu.
Dr. Ndlovu, thank you for joining us on The Advocate.
Thank you.
Dr. Ndlovu, you are a representative of the Patriotic Front,
Yes, at the United Nations and North America too, yes.
and you teach at Hofstra College.
I'm professor of history and political science at Hofstra University and director of African studies.
And you're from Zimbabwe.
I'm from Zimbabwe, yes.
Would you tell us what the Patriotic Front hopes to achieve in and for Zimbabwe?
Well, the Patriotic Front's position was spelled out a long time ago, and the position was that we are fighting for a future in Zimbabwe in which all people, irrespective of race, color, or creed, will be allowed to participate in governing the country or in running the country. Our goal still remains. We are not aware of any changes that have taken place so far with respect to making that country non-racial. As long as the constitution upon which the future of the country is run is based upon racial lines, the Patriotic Front cannot accept such an arrangement. So it means, therefore, that from the point of view of the Patriotic Front, we cannot accept an arrangement which is a prescription for a future civil conflict. I just want to add by telling you that in Lebanon, in Ireland, and in Cyprus, you have conflicts that were caused by constitutions that were based on communities, and those constitutions proved to be non-viable as population arrangements shifted.
The other side has said that this Constitution provides us with a step forward. That is progress. Then the question goes to the Patriotic Front, why can't you come and join in this great march forward as this progress is made? Why is that progress not possible?
Well, you see, the word progress is relative. It depends on who's talking about progress. For South Africa, it is progress. Because what South Africa has succeeded in doing in Zimbabwe, if we can't stop it, is to create a king-size Bantustan. It is a king-size Bantustan on 2 levels. On the one hand, you have a constitution that makes whites vote separately for white candidates, and then allows those whites to vote along blacks, and creating a situation where whites have a voting advantage of 11-1, meaning in fact that for every 1 black vote, a white voter had 11 votes. That is the ratio if you work it out.
A bit on the mechanics of this election, and whether even mechanically you think them to be free and fair. Could you comment on the voting of school children and the keeps and the protected villages and things of that kind?
We have produced a comprehensive document which is now a Security Council document S/13277. Now, in that document, we demonstrate the fact that these elections were neither free, fair, nor democratic.
Why?
Because, first, there was no list of registered voters. When Mr. Smith and his blacksmiths decided that there was a 63% turnout, what they really meant was that they just developed an imaginary figure. And out of this figure, they talked about a percentage turnout.
Could we end this war by use of internationally supervised elections?
Well, yes, if we had a mutually accepted constitution or arrangement.
Does your party
I'm sorry,
accept
we're gonna go
internationally
on to Mr.
supervised
Nelson
elections?
now. Mr. Nelson, would you
Yes.
like to cross-examine Dr. Ndlovu?
Thank you. Professor, you talked before about democratic institutions. Do you disagree with Mr. Mugabe, who is one of the leaders of the Patriotic Front, when he made the statement that he is in favor of a one-party Marxist state where elections would be, to quote his word, a luxury?
Well, you see, there's not a question of disagreeing with Mr. Mugabe. Mr. Mugabe, after saying what you claim he said, has also said he's prepared to participate in free elections. Mr. Mugabe accepted this at the Malta I and Malta II talks. And Mr. Mugabe, like any Zimbabwean leader, is free to say he's prepared to accept, to take this particular position, just as Mr. Sithole Muzorewa favor a fascist state.
But, but you would admit then, that Mr. Mugabe is indeed in favor of a Marxist one-party state, and that if he were to come to power, there would not even be these kinds of elections, let alone free and supervised elections in the future.
Mr. Mugabe, in fact, never said he's in favor of a one-party Marxist state. What Mr. Mugabe said was that he favors a socialist state. And if his party is given 100% vote, he would be able to establish a one-party Marxist state.
I would suggest...
but Mr. Mugabe has also said he's willing to participate in free elections.
And
he can't establish such a government if he's willing to participate in free elections.
I would suggest that you listen again to a transcript of the April 23rd, 1978 press conference which he held, in which he made the statement. Now let's go to the other leader, Mr. Nkomo, the other leader of the Patriotic Front. Isn't it true that not very long ago he was willing to make concessions, in fact agreed to a situation which gave the whites even more power, that is the blacks even less power than the current Constitution gives today?
Yeah, well, that is the structural, what we call the structural view of politics. It doesn't make any sense at all.
Did he agree to it or not?
I think you have to look at what Mr. Nkomo was looking for.
Because I know he was looking for. He agreed to 50.
Let me answer the question.
Let me give the structure, then you can comment on it. He agreed to 50 out of 100 seats being whites. He also agreed that there would be income prescriptions and that there would be other kinds of requirements in terms of education with regard to who's going to vote. He made that agreement.
The point on which Mr. Nkomo and Smith's talks failed was on the question of racism. Mr. Nkomo rejected the arrangement where whites vote for whites only, and it was on that basis that Mr. Smith could not even accept that. In any case, Mr. Nkomo made those concessions at a certain stage of the struggle, and the struggle has moved to a level at which every time Mr. Smith fails to make an agreement, the demands of the Africans escalate.
Yes,
and you must understand, therefore, that we're at a time now that what was possible in 1975 is totally impossible now.
Yes, but I use this to point out... that the very leaders that you support in the Patriotic Front were indeed willing to make certain concessions, and I think there is agreement that we're talking about a transitional system and therefore a transitional document. And isn't it true now that what we really have in Rhodesia is a struggle between black leaders? We have the Patriotic Front headed by 2 black leaders, and the question of who would actually control if the Patriotic Front ever won is yet unresolved. And the elected bishop, Muzorewa, is on the other side. It's a struggle between blacks, not between blacks and whites.
It's a struggle between Zimbabweans and loyalists. And if I may say this, if you had taken George Washington in 1776 to accept a constitution based upon the prescriptions of loyalists, I can tell you that George Washington would have refused to accept that. And that is exactly where we are. We are not prepared to accept the prescriptions of a loyalist 5th column. And
so for that, there's war?
Mr. Nelson, I'm sorry, thank you very much. Dr. Ndlovu, thank you very much for joining us on the Advocate. Thank you very much. For those of you who may have joined us late, the question that we're debating tonight is, should we give our support to the new government of Zimbabwe Rhodesia? Advocate Avi Nelson has presented 2 witnesses, Leonard Sussman and Dr. Matthew Wakatama, in favor of U.S. support of the new government. Advocate Randall Robinson has presented 1 witness, Callistus Ndlovu, against support for the government. And now I turn to Ms. Robinson for another witness.
I call Sister Janice McLaughlin.
Sister Janice, welcome to the Advocates.
Sister Janice, you've lived and worked in Rhodesia. Could you tell us some of the circumstances of your work and particularly the circumstances of your departure?
I was working with the Catholic Commission for Justice and Peace in Rhodesia. It's a church group that's been dedicated to bringing about a just peace. making known the injustice which caused the war and to help the victims of the war. And one of the things I was working on was investigating the war crimes of the Smith regime, and we were producing documents showing that torture is a systematic policy of the regime, showing that civilian deaths are common, showing conditions in the concentration camps, or the so-called protected villages. And because of this, myself and 3 others were arrested. We were accused of causing alarm and despondency, and then I was held in prison for 3 weeks and then deported.
Now, you have supported the Patriotic Front. Could you tell me why?
Well, I support their goals, the objectives that they're struggling to achieve of a just, non-racial society. But I think more important is who the people of Zimbabwe support. I found in my experience that the people there supported the Patriotic Front. Every African I met, many of the whites I met, supported the Patriotic Front, spoke highly of them. I look on them as an authentic nationalist force. I look on them as people struggling against a fascist police state. And the church itself has met with the leaders of the Patriotic Front many times. They are not anti-Christian as they're alleged to be. And even the Pope himself last November met with them.
Could you tell me, given that reality for you, why the voter turnout was so large?
Well, I believe, and members of the Justice and Peace Commission for whom I work came to this country and testified before the House Committee, that the vote was large and would be large because there was massive intimidation. People had no choice but to vote. There have been many reports. Just last week I talked to people from the British Parliamentary Human Rights Group. They have produced a 60-page report documenting case by case intimidation.
Is that the Lord Chitness report?
Lord Chitness, that's
Yes.
right. Cases of intimidation, of actual murder of people who were against the election, the activities of the auxiliaries, a scorched earth policy, all of these things which are much more serious. Mr. Sussman talked about encouraging people to vote. People were forced to vote. They had no choice not to vote.
Can you tell me what the Patriotic Front can achieve that the Muzorewa government cannot achieve?
Well, I think there are many reforms that need to be made there, and I think this Constitution prevents those reforms from being made. Land, for instance, is one of the major problems. The Africans live on very overcrowded tribal trust lands, very overstocked, and under this Constitution, the whites will maintain their land. There will have to be compensation, and very few Africans could afford that. Also medical benefits, educational services, all of these things. And also just a change in the legal system, a change in the police and the army, which have been the ones terrorizing, torturing the people. All of these things are not allowed under the internal settlement.
Quick question. The American people seem to have a negative view of the Patriotic Front. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, because the Smith government tries to hide the truth. I mean, I think my case is a perfect example. When we tried to get out the truth about things, we're arrested, we're detained, we're deported. It's simply not allowed. There's such censorship there. And also, I think a very serious thing is that the government itself has soldiers who masquerade as freedom fighters, who then commit atrocities in order deliberately to discredit the real freedom fighters. And in many cases, this happened in the killing of missionaries.
Mr. Robinson, let's go to Mr. Nelson for cross-examination.
Sister, you were not present to observe the elections, correct?
No, I was not, but the people
Isn't it
I worked
true,
with
then,
were.
that the one person you cited, Lord Chitness, was the sole exception to what was, by international observation teams, unanimous approval of the electoral process, as Mr. Sussman said earlier? Isn't that true?
Lord Chitness was not alone. There was also Ms. Sedworth. Also, the Commission for Justice and Peace, which is about 75 people, put out a report before the election showing that it could not be free and fair.
That's before the election. Let me talk a little bit about the regime that you have so much antagonism for, and legitimately so. But all your criticisms are of the Ian Smith regime that is about to be no longer in power. Isn't it true that the comments that you're going to make about the new regime have to wait because we don't know exactly how well or how poorly this regime will do? Isn't that true?
Looking at the Constitution, I see no possibility for there to be a new regime. I see it as a continuation of the old regime with a few new faces brought into it.
Well, that's... You speak very disparagingly of Bishop Muzorewa and of the 72 newly elected members of Parliament, the black members of Parliament. And while we're on the subject of whether things are going to be as they are or as they were or as they will be, isn't it true that while we're talking about elections that the Patriotic Front, of which you are supported, by the way, not only in terms of goals but also the means, we're also responsible for a great deal of violence trying to keep people away from the polls?
Well, first, I'm not disparaging individuals as individuals. I think we have to look at the consequences of their acts, not their motivations or the people. As far as I am aware, the Patriotic Front did not, in fact, disrupt the elections, and this was brought out in our papers that there was very little instances of disruption.
Sister, it may have been out in your papers, but with every other observer group, including Freedom House, there were recorded instances of landmines being put near polls. As a matter of fact, it has been a tradition of the Patriotic Front to engage in these kinds of terrorist activities. I'd like to read you a quote of yours. "I don't want to go to Europe and plead for a negotiated settlement at the expense of the armed struggle. At your trial, you said, 'I believe revolution is needed.' The question that I have is, why is it that you would turn to means of violence instead of working within the system, or at least seeing if the newly elected government will be able to accomplish some of the goals that you share?"
I still stand by those statements because I feel that all peaceful means had been exhausted. I felt that this was a just war. I still feel that it is. I feel that the objectives for which the freedom fighters are fighting have not been achieved. And I feel that it's a case of fighting against fascism. And the United States supported that in the First and Second World War. Churches supported it, and I think we should support the Patriotic Front.
You talk about freedom fighters. Isn't there a time when they are no longer freedom fighters but really should be called terrorists? For example, when there is raping, when they shoot 13 unarmed survivors of a downed plane, when there are landmines placed deliberately so that civilians will be killed. Are these the actions of freedom fighters or really more likely guerrilla terrorists?
Well, I found the largest instances of terrorism were on the part of the Smith government. All the cases
I'm
I
asking you about the
investigated were
Patriotic
done.
Front. I outlined specific instances which the Patriotic Front has perpetrated. The fact that Ian Smith's government has done it does not justify the Patriotic Front's doing it, and the Ian Smith government is no longer in existence. Would you say the Patriotic Front should no longer be in existence?
No, I believe that they have not achieved their objectives. I believe that their acts are, in acts of war, people do get killed. And in the wars, we also in Vietnam killed civilians.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Nelson, excuse me. Thank you, Sister Janice, for joining us on the Advocate. Now we're going to get back to Mr. Nelson. You can call a witness in rebuttal, if you will.
Professor Chester Crocker.
Welcome to the Advocates, Professor Crocker.
Professor Crocker is Director of African Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies at Georgetown University. Professor Crocker, what is the chances for success of the new government if the United States does not give its support?
I think a lot depends on the kind of outside support the new government receives. After all, if no outside support is forthcoming, this drives the new regime virtually into the arms of South Africa. If outside support is forthcoming, it broadens the options of the Muzorewa government, both vis-a-vis South Africa and vis-a-vis the local whites resident in Rhodesia.
If we turn for a moment to our own interests here in the United States, is it in the United States' best interest to support the new government?
It seems to me quite obvious that it is. After all, if we as a leader of the free nations of the world turn our backs and walk away from what is an imperfect but nonetheless democratic process of political change, it seems to me that has broad global implications. We are supposed to be the leader of the free nations. But more important than this, if we do not back this government, I think we are destined to see the progressive unraveling of the very viable economic system in Rhodesia and a strong administrative apparatus. And what will that leave us if and when the Patriotic Front should take over is a shambles furthermore utterly dependent on Soviet-Cuban manpower.
Professor Crocker, there has been the statement made that if we recognize the new government or move to support it, that we will alienate other African states. Is that true?
I think much depends on what happens in the next few months. Quite frankly, I believe African leaders to be as pragmatic as leaders everywhere else in the world, although perhaps some others don't agree with that. Africans have to look and see what develops on the ground. African states have made known on many occasions their ability to be pragmatic and to face up to realities that do exist. Many African leaders are well aware that Bishop Muzorewa is no puppet and no sellout. They know that he was the person who unified African nationalist opinion against the sellout terms of 1971 that the British and the Rhodesians tried to work out. Therefore, I'm quite confident that some African leaders will step forward over time and do business with the new government there.
Professor, what do you think should be the United States policy, specifically? What should be the procedures that we should follow now?
I think it's in our interest to indicate recognition of support of the new government in terms of saying that there has been a new process, there is a new system, there is a totally different situation on the ground in the country. It is now a black government. There's no reason for us to come right out next week and to recognize that government or lift sanctions next week. What we should be doing is trying to encourage that government to broaden and strengthen itself. The only way that I see we can encourage negotiations is to indicate that there is, in fact, a balanced American policy. Waging economic warfare against the Muzorewa government is not a balanced American policy.
By the way, speaking of the United States involvement, would military involvement necessarily follow? Some people have said there's going to be another Vietnam.
The Vietnam analogy continues to haunt us. There is no North Vietnam in Southern Africa. There is no Viet Cong in Southern Africa either. The key issue, and this is still a young war, I would argue, the key issue is who will win the race to transfer resources, to organize, to arm, to train, and to mobilize the still largely uncommitted majority of black Zimbabweans. That race has not yet been won. It depends very much on who does business with whom, who supports the Patriotic Front, and who supports the new government in Salisbury.
Let's move internally for a moment.
Quick question, please, Mr.
What
Nelson.
about the military situation within the government itself? Is it clear that the Patriotic Front will win and that the newly elected government will lose?
It certainly is not clear. The army of Joshua and Como cannot get across the Zambezi River. The guerrillas coming across from Mozambique are anything but winning. They're taking very heavy casualties indeed. And there's no reason to indicate an automatic or inevitable victory by the Patriotic Front. I would say the present situation is a delicate and fragile balance, but favoring the government so far. Much depends on the next few months.
Thank you. Mr. Robinson, would you like to cross-examine Professor Crocker?
Mr. Crocker, I think I should say in starting that this exercise is more than just a debate to me. I have some great sympathy for the blacks who oppose discrimination and oppression in Southern Africa because I'm black, and I've opposed the same thing here. And I sort of want to put this in the American context so that Americans here and across this country can understand what you're supporting and what you're proposing. Are you prepared, as you're prepared to support this Rhodesian solution, prepared to support turning over half the Senate, half the House, the State Department, the Defense Department, the Treasury, half the land, virtually the total wealth of this country, and the leadership of it to black Americans? Are you prepared to do that? Because that's the kind of democracy you're talking about embracing in Rhodesia. And because I think that's the kind, you won't get the kind of response you think you will from Rhodesians broadly. Are you prepared to support that?
That isn't the issue before us.
That is the issue.
You are
before
making
us.
out, Mr. Robinson, that somehow we are facing a situation in which this new Constitution is enshrined in concrete for the next decade. The situation I'm describing is a scenario of gradual change. If we deny all support, and everybody else does too, to the new government, it will be stuck where it is, and it will eventually crumble.
Are
but
you
with
to tell
outside
me,
support, Mr. Robinson, it has
then-
every reason to think it can
then
bargain
you're-
and
then you're
negotiate a
telling
better
me-
deal. Do you
then
want my
you-
answer, Mr. Robinson?
Yes, I want to know exactly what you're telling me, and I don't want you to use up too much of the time in doing that. Then you're telling me then you don't support this Constitution, that you do find it inequitable.
I find this Constitution imperfect. I'd be the first to say
You find
so.
it
It is an imperfect.
inequitable.
It's an imperfect Constitution, Mr. Robinson. How many constitutions in Africa are perfect? Is it our job to tell Africans when a constitution is perfect or not?
But Africans didn't... That's just my point, Professor Crocker. Let's find out whether Africans in Zimbabwe think it's perfect or not. Let's give them a chance by referendum to vote on this Constitution. Would you support that?
I'm not against that principle, certainly.
Do you support that?
Sure.
Then you do. Then
The
but
kind of
how can you
diplomacy I'm
support-
talking
How
about-
can you support at the same time a government that denied Africans the right to do that?
As I said a moment ago, it is not my point of view that we should say next week we lift sanctions. I think we should use our ability to develop leverage vis-a-vis
Then
both
you're
Muzorewa
suggesting-
and the Patriotic Front
You're
to get an improvement in the situation on the ground there.
Oh, then you think that this Constitution ought to change, and you think it can change.
I think it can change,
But the
certainly.
Constitution says expressly that it's to be this way for the next 10 years, if not indefinitely. How can you support a government that is rested on that Constitution?
I think it's fair to argue that the Rhodesian Front government had a problem with its white supporters, which it tried to finesse by guaranteeing them things it really cannot guarantee. And over time, you will see the erosion of all those guarantees. It's just
But
a question of when.
are we to take the seminal legal instrument on which a society is built and treat it casually? That is a solemn obligation. The same way you regard this Constitution here, Africans regard their Constitution. It is to be written by them, it is to be approved by them, it is to be non-racialist.
I would submit that
Don't you support that?
The internal nationalists...
Do you support that?
I would submit that the internal nationalists in this situation have in effect done themselves a disservice by publishing their own constitution. They are being hung up on democratic principles by people on the outside who don't know what democracy means and would never apply it if they were in office.
All right, thank you very much, Ms. Robinson. Professor Crocker, thank you for joining us. Mr. Robinson, I'm sorry I had to cut you off, but now you have an opportunity to call your witness in rebuttal.
I call Senator Tsongas.
Thanks for joining us, Senator.
Senator Tsongas, is support of this new regime in the foreign policy interest of the United States?
Yes, I think it is the same way our support of Cuba and Vietnam was in our national interest.
What do you mean by that? Would you expand on that?
Well, I think anyone who's looked at the issue would recognize that the most vehement force, the most valid force in Africa today is nationalism. And indeed, communism...
What does nationalism mean?
Well, I guess it's like Lexington and Concord, or the Boston Tea Party, people determining their own destiny. And yet we try to impose on Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, the view that capitalism or communism or Marxism is indeed the motivating force. And again, we find ourselves on the wrong side of history.
Could you tell me what the consequences might be of the United States turning its back on the situation, on the problem of Southern Africa?
Well, in a practical sense, I'm not sure it makes a difference at all, because you're going to have a situation where majority rule will come in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. Indeed, majority rule will come in South Africa. And what we do is really, in some ways, incidental to that process. History is moving in the direction. The question for us is, are we going to make fools of ourselves? Are we going to turn our backs, for example, on issues like racial justice? Remember that? The 1960s, we used to talk about that.
I know the same people who call them terrorists in Southern Africa called us communists in this country for striving for what we're striving for.
I think they were Tories 200 years ago.
Could you tell me what our support for the new regime will do in terms of what the Soviets and the Chinese will do? Would we not be opening up a great opportunity for the Soviets and Chinese by not supporting this regime? I mean, what are the consequences here of that?
Well, let's look at our history. The same arguments you're hearing today from Muzorewa applied to Batista in Cuba. We supported him, in came Castro, and we showed him a thing or two. He's been there for 19 years. We did it with Trujillo, Dominican Republic. We saw what happened there. Thieu in Vietnam, and we continue this process. We support this internal settlement with the obvious racial injustice, irrespective of what we claim to believe in. Then Nkrumah and Mugabe have no choice. They will go to the Soviets, they will go to the Cubans, because we have turned them down. And that is the historic pattern, that those who argue against these particular people, patriotic front, are just yearning to give entree to the Soviets. And as soon as that happens, we escalate. And this country's been down that road before.
Where do we go from here?
Well, it seems to me that there's an agreement that's stated, I would hope, that an all-parties conference and a democratic elected government with UN supervision indeed should be the long-term solution. There was discussion earlier that indeed this government in power now represents majority. Well, why not bring in the UN? Let's have elections supervised by that body and see what happens. So whoever wins, wins, and let's go from there.
Do you imagine there are any racial implications in the United States? Who supports lifting sanctions? Who supports the notion of supporting this government, and who opposes it in this country?
It was intriguing during the vote in the Senate when members of the Senate were getting up to talk about how free these elections were and how that was the reason that we should lift sanctions. These were the same people who were trying to lift sanctions before there was an election, before there was an internal settlement. So I think it's a question of whose ox is being gored, perhaps, at a particular time. They would lift sanctions if Smith was in there and he alone was in power.
Thanks very much, Mr. Nelson.
Senator, isn't it true that you don't know what the new policies of the new government will be?
Well, the new government indeed has embraced the Constitution.
But you don't know in terms of the ism, whether it's capitalism, socialism, Marxism, collectivism, individualism. You don't know what they're going to follow, do you?
Well, I believe that there is a Constitution. They have embraced that Constitution, and I would suggest that that Constitution reflects a particular policy. That policy is guaranteed white control over that government.
What I was driving at is that when you talk about philosophy versus nationalism, isn't indeed the previous election, the one we just had where 1.3 million people voted for the UANC, isn't that an expression of nationalism? What I'm asking is this.
Can I answer the question?
Go ahead. Well, let me phrase it this way. Should you be the final arbiter? Should you be the final arbiter of what is in the national interest of the Rhodesians, or should it be the Rhodesians?
I seem to recall you making statements about elections in the Soviet Union, where you had 98% turnout.
Next on my list.
98% turnout in the Soviet Union. Would you advocate that those are free elections? Do
No.
you support?
As a matter of fact, Senator, but let me take your metaphor a bit further. Would you, because you came across human rights violations or processes going on within the elections that you did not approve of, would you suggest that we level economic sanctions against the Soviet Union or withdraw diplomatic recognition?
Well, I suppose you could use the same argument in terms of, for example, the damage that was done in Lexington and Concord.
Why don't you answer that question? I asked you a question. Would you withdraw diplomatic recognition or impose economic sanctions on the Soviet Union or Iran or China or any other country where you found that the electoral process was not up to our standards? We each have our galleries, apparently.
The question is where the majority is.
As I'm sure
Mr.
you're
Nelson,
aware, since you
left-
participated in that vote in the Senate.
Mr. Nelson, do you want your questions answered?
I said, as you're aware, since you participated on the losing side in that vote in the Senate.
Well, the Tonkin Gulf resolution was 88-2.
It was 98-2. Let me ask you a question. You talked about the Vietnam scenario. I got the feeling, bring back the good old days of Vietnam. Is it conceivable to you?
They were not the good old days to me, and they were not the good old days of the 55,000 Americans who died in that war.
I'm well aware of the problem. But the problem that I'm driving at is that it became a very important political situation, and I think you have a strained analogy here with the situation in southern Africa. What I wanted to ask you is, can you conceive of a situation whereby we would give support to a regime, recognize it diplomatically, trade with it economically, and not ever send troops militarily to prop up the regime if it should totter?
Well, you begin a process, and you get involved. It's kind of like an addiction, sort of like being pregnant. At some point, you don't stop the process. And there is indeed, in this country, the willingness. Once having gotten involved, then the Russians come in. That threatens us. We cannot stand by for that. We get involved more. They get involved.
One last question.
Well, you don't want to see where the process goes, apparently.
I got the gist of it with pregnancy. Isn't it true that there were constitutions during the phase-in transitions to other countries, African states, to become independent, Tanzania, Kenya, Zambia, where there were guarantees given in the Constitution to protect the power of whites during the transition period? Those were later abandoned during full independence. And isn't it true that during those transition periods, we did not impose economic sanctions, and we did acknowledge the process and indeed applaud it and encourage it?
Now we really need a quick answer.
Why don't we do exactly that?
Yes.
Why don't we go back as I did in Kenya, get rid of this constitution, have an all-parties conference, have a UN-supervised election, and indeed let the majority rule. And for the first time in Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, let's have peace.
Thanks very much, Senator Saunders. Thank you for joining us on the Advocate. Fast moving. It's now time for closing arguments. Mr. Nelson, you have 1 minute.
The question is whether we are going to turn our back on a democratic process and opt for more war. The fact is, if the United States does not get involved and remove the economic sanctions, and indeed show some support for the newly elected and duly elected black government in Rhodesia, we are going to find that that government will probably topple. And what will be the result of that? Black Rhodesians and white Rhodesians will be disheartened about the possibility of being able to use the electoral process and gain favor in nations outside the world. The fact is that this is the plebiscite that was held in Rhodesia. The fact is that there is a new black prime minister. There are 72 black Africans, Rhodesians, serving in parliament. It is a transition phase and a transition document, imperfect to be sure, but the fact is also that other African countries, starting with less, have achieved independence. It is in the interest of the Rhodesians, in the interest of the peace that we all want, and in the interest of the United States to recognize the new government in Rhodesia.
Thank you very much. Mr. Robinson, 1 minute.
In 1968, the United Nations Security Council, for the first time in its history, imposed Chapter 7 comprehensive mandatory sanctions against Rhodesia because Prime Minister Ian Smith, representing a tiny minority of whites, steadfastly refused to deliver to the blacks majority rule. That condition still exists, and it has brought about a war that has cost 15,000 to 20,000 lives in the last six years in Zimbabwe. Until the causes of that war are resolved, that war will continue. It can be easily resolved if we achieve a democratic solution there based on one person, one equal vote, and an egalitarian society not based on race. It is to that end that this nation has to commit itself. To do less would align us with South Africa against the rest of the world and the entire family of nations. I ask that you vote against any U.S. support for this still existing racist regime in Rhodesia.
Thank you. Thank you. And now we turn to all of you in our audience. Tell us what you think about this issue. Should we give our support to the new government of Zimbabwe, Rhodesia? Send us your comments and your vote, yes or no, on a postcard to the Advocates, Box 1979, Boston 02134. And we hope you'll join us next week. Thank you, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Robinson, your distinguished witnesses, and thanks to our hosts here at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University.
If you would like a written copy of tonight's debate, send $2 to Transcript, Post Office Box 1979, Boston 02134.
This program was produced by WGBH-TV, which is solely responsible for its content, and was made possible by grants from the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation and Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith, Incorporated.
The Advocates is produced with the cooperation of the Institute of Politics of the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University.